Morning. It's good to be with all of you again today. Yesterday, we spent some time exploring that theme of incursion, particularly as it relates to the doctrine of discovery and its impact upon colonization and the Christianization of Native peoples in North America. In particular, we talked about the destructive incursion among what we now call the Two-Spirit and indigiquere persons and communities, and its devastating impact in Native communities and cultures. But as I mentioned yesterday, we cannot historicize Native peoples and communities. We cannot focus only on a particular era. We cannot speak of Native peoples only in the past tense. Many Native communities survived colonization, thanks be to God, because of their resilience, their brilliance, their tenacity, their strength. Native peoples and communities resisted and adapted, evolved into the 574 federally recognized sovereign nations that constitute Native America. There are more. Native peoples are contemporary peoples. This dual theme of resistance and integration will be the lens through which we continue our exploration of Two-Spirit and indigiquere persons in modernity and in our age. The 3 oral history interviews we will explore this morning will introduce us to persons who span the Two-Spirit and indigiquere spectrum. One interviewee is a partner cisgendered female who identifies as indigiquere. One is a single cisgendered male who identifies as a gay man. The third is a non-binary polyamorous person who identifies as Two-Spirit. Also, the 3 interviews selected are elders in the Two-Spirit and indigiquere community. These interviews are not only the richest interviews I conducted, they also represent the experiences, narratives, and perspectives that are most likely to be lost in the coming decades. The first interview we'll explore is with the person that we're going to call Sandy. Sandy's interview was conducted via phone. Sandy is a 75-year-old cisgendered woman who lives in New England. Sandy is from a northern Great Plains tribe that we won't name today. She was born and raised in the Great Lakes region of the United States. Sandy has a partner who is a 65-year-old Caucasian woman whom Sandy met in her work in behavioral health. Sandy and her partner have no children together, but Sandy has 3 children and 5 grandchildren from a previous marriage to a cisgender Native man. Sandy has served in elected and professional roles within her tribal community. She is a national leader in Native behavioral health. Sandy is not out to everyone, which is why we will withhold some information today. So she reports that most people know, even though it's not something commonly discussed among her friends and kin. Sandy is well known and respected in her tribe and in the Two-Spirit and indigiquere community, where she's the proud auntie to Two-Spirit and indigiquere persons across the US and Canada. Yes, sir. Better? Sure. The second interview we'll explore is with the person we'll call Mike. Mike's interview was conducted via Zoom. Mike is a 64-year-old cisgendered man who lives in Phoenix, Arizona. Mike was born in Cuba, but spent most of his formative years in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic, where he and his family relocated to during the Cuban crisis. Mike is from the Taino people, the indigenous people of the Caribbean islands, Puerto Rico, and Cuba. He is a physician, an educator, and an independent Catholic bishop whose religious society serves disenfranchised and marginalized Catholics across the United States. Mike self-identifies as an out gay man, though he is uncomfortable with labels and constructed binaries. He is unmarried and has no children, but he is a father to many in his religious community and beyond. In addition to being a physician, Mike is a curandero, healer who uses folk remedies and spirit medicine to assess disease and to bring healing for persons in their bodies, minds, spirits, communities. The third interview we'll explore is with the person we will call Dakota. Dakota's interview was conducted in person. Dakota's interview, by the way, was 3.5 hours. So it was a very amazing experience. Dakota is a 67-year-old non-binary two-spirit person whose pronouns are he, she, and they. Dakota was born in Shawnee, Oklahoma, and is a longtime resident here of Tulsa. Dakota is descended from the Osage and Peoria peoples, but their kinship circle also includes the Cheyenne, the Blackfeet, the Muskogee. Dakota has been instrumental in the revitalization of two-spirit and indigenous queer life here in Oklahoma. They have served as mentor, or as I call them, mother, to many two-spirit and indigenous queer persons all over Indian country. And they're proud to be the unofficial liaison and advocate for two-spirit people in the LGBTQ plus community in Tulsa and with tribes across the United States. Dakota has a passion for recovering and reclaiming what they call two-spirit medicine that they lament was buried with two-spirit people who cannot pass it on due to the effects of colonization and Christianization. It is Dakota who actually helped me come up with the title for the thesis I'm presenting today. There's a considerable divergence in the interviews we are going to explore today. The context of the lives and the lived experiences of the interviewees vary widely. Yet a close reading of these interviews reveals a surprisingly strong narrative thread that weaves its way through these respected stories, giving shape to an oral history that beautifully illustrates the reemergence and resilience of two-spirit and indigenous queer life in modernity today. A tripartite pattern emerges, one comprised of reflections on the influences of Native Christianity in the formative years of life, the creative conflict of coming to terms with and recovering and reclaiming two-spirit and indigenous queer experiences and identities in adulthood, and what the future holds for two-spirit and indigenous queer persons and communities. These three themes serve to frame this narrative tapestry in such a way that not only reflects the strength and beauty of our individual and collective pasts, they also serve to inform and inspire others who want to embrace and celebrate their own two-spirit and indigenous queer identities, or the identities and experiences of beloved two-spirit and indigenous queer brothers, sisters, and kin. All three interviewees reported that they were raised in a Christian home and that this religious identity was a primary influence upon their lives in their formative years. While the interviewees were raised in different religious traditions, all three identified with their inherited faith tradition closely as children and adolescents. Mike and Sandy identified the religious and spiritual traditions of their family of origin as a primary means of identification for both the interviewee and their family. Additionally, Mike and Dakota both proffered that these respective religious communities have rivaled their tribal communities in influence and importance. As Dakota observed poignantly, we were Indian Methodists. Methodist was the noun, Indian was the adjective, not the other way around. And best not forget it, end quote. An in-depth exploration of the spiritual and religious histories of these interviewees will bring to light the effects of Christianization upon two-spirit and indigenous queer persons in our contemporary era. Dakota's relationship to his family's Christian faith has always been complicated. Dakota's father was a handsome, charismatic Methodist minister, a man people were naturally drawn to. Dakota's mother was raised a Baptist, he quote, very staunch. Despite Dakota's mother's stalwart Baptist faith, Dakota and his three brothers were raised Methodist because, quote, that's just the way things were back then. If dad was a Methodist, you were a Methodist, end quote. Dakota speaks candidly about the impact of his family's Methodist faith, not only upon his sexuality and gender identity, but upon his father's sexuality and gender identity as well. Dakota states, Methodists ride the fence, his quote, not mine. They're afraid of confrontation, They're not going to get deep into it. My dad never talked about homosexuality because he struggled with his own sexuality. He struggled with his own gender identity, I think. He struggled with so much. At a point, it just finally broke down. So, anyway, I was raised up like I was raised up in the church where you just didn't talk about such things. Dakota is quick to assert that his parents were good people, good Indian people, he says, who did the very best they could to raise Dakota and their three siblings despite the family's struggles and shortcomings. They were kind and loving people, and Dakota never went to bed hungry. His clothes were always clean, he was always loved and happy, but it was a lack of mental health, a lack of anger management, a lack of healthy sexuality that plagued his family. He says it just exploded because of Christian tyranny, because it just suppresses natural desires and sexual pains. He says, my mother and dad would be screaming at each other almost every night. And I remember lying there talking to the old ones. Even then, they were with me, end quote. Dakota's parents knew he was different from a young age. Dakota cherishes a picture their mother gave Dakota, showing them proudly wearing a ribbon skirt at the age of 3. Dakota's father was less receptive to Dakota's feminine self-expression. He says, I was conditioned by that so-called Christian charity from a young age. It kind of confused me because I knew who I was and that who I was right. But the outside forces that took care of me were saying it wasn't right. It's extremely confusing to a child. So I struggled with weight. I struggled with anxiety. I struggled with so much. The feeling of attracting to the same sex, it kind of destroys you a little bit. Dakota left Christianity as a young adult and found refuge among Two-Spirit and indigenous brothers, sisters, and kin across North America, what Dakota calls the Rainbow Nation. Dakota felt particularly drawn to traditional Two-Spirit people and tribal communities less influenced by what he calls Christian tyranny. Over time, Dakota participated in ceremonies with a great number of Two-Spirit persons from countless tribes, usually in intertribal settings. Though Dakota sometimes visits churches and other houses of worship, their spirituality is now entirely focused on bringing back Two-Spirit medicine for Two-Spirit people, a medicine that he says, quote, has been buried by Christian tyranny, medicine that Indian people need now more than ever, end quote. Sandy describes her religious upbringing as vaguely evangelical. While the family attended church with some regularity, Sandy did not recall formally joining a community of faith or attending any one congregation for more than a few months. Sandy feels the primary factor in her family's habit of church hopping was her father's alcoholism. Decades later, she would come to believe that her father was looking for a conversion experience or religious community that would free him from his dependence on alcohol. Unfortunately, his search for healing was unsuccessful in this world. Sandy reports that she was raised in a Christian home, however, and that there were periods of piety and devotion that coincided with her father's sobriety cycles. When her father was sober, church attendance was regular. The family engaged in prayer before meals, and the family would often read from the Bible together before bed. The family's religiosity would cease during her father's many, many relapses. During her father's relapses, Sandy would attend church with friends and neighbors. Despite the cyclical and impermanent nature of her family's religiosity and its connection to her father's sobriety, Sandy identified as a devout Christian during her childhood and adolescence. She was baptized the summer of her 7th grade year during vacation Bible school at the local Baptist church. She received a small white Bible from her Sunday school teacher, which she hid from her family for reasons still unknown to her. Sandy felt her white Bible became a secret talisman for her during her times of stress and grief. In adolescence, Sandy's Christian identity was firm but flexible. She attended church with friends, frequently adopting their religious identities in rapid succession. She jokes about having belonged to every church in town at one time or another, except the Catholic Church and the Mormon Church, which her parents forbade. That was the line that you didn't cross. Sandy admits to having been decidedly uninterested in the particularities of theology or worship in each community. Sandy's faith was simple and uncomplicated. Church was somewhere a person went to be close to Jesus and spend time with friends. I think that's a good theology. It was not until after puberty that Sandy began to experience a fracturing of her identity. By the time she entered high school, Sandy felt that she was living in three different worlds. This growing unease and cognitive dissonance came to characterize her teenage years. For Sandy found it increasingly difficult to integrate her life at school and church with her life at home and her life in her tribal community, a tribal community that, in her recollection, was becoming increasingly traditional around that time. As Sandy's home life began to rapidly disintegrate during her sophomore year, her native aunties and uncles began to take an increasingly active role in raising her. They shared with her the traditional ways of the Northern Plains tribes and their perspective on the colonization and Christianization of those tribes, a perspective that was disturbingly antithetical to the whitewashed myths of courageous and charitable missionaries saving thankful converts he had gladly received as gospel truth as a child. The fracturing of her identity came to a breaking point the summer of Sandy's senior year in high school following the death of her father. Sandy sought solace in an increasingly emotionally intimate relationship with a female friend, a cousin in the Indian way. While physically this relationship never progressed beyond casual affection, this was the first time Sandy felt emotionally and sexually attracted to an individual in a sustained way, a relationship that she would later identify as her first love. The following autumn, Sandy left for college and became affiliated with the well-known evangelical campus ministry. It was at a retreat for this organization that Sandy learned that romantic and sexual exchanges between persons of the same sex were thought by many Christians to be a sin that would result in eternal damnation. Sandy eventually defected from this organization and became active in the growing American Indian movement, a pan-tribal movement that understood the work of Native liberation to include the casting off of the colonizers' religion, with its restrictive and oppressive sexual morality and anti-Indigenous values. While Sandy would continue to identify as a follower of the Jesus way throughout her life, the beginning of her journey with the American Indian movement signaled the end of her identity as a Christian. Mike reports that he is and has always been Catholic. He is proud of his cradle Catholic identity and shared that it was his grandmother who raised him in this faith tradition. Mike also shared that Catholicism was the norm in the community and the culture of his childhood and adolescence. He identified Catholicism as, quote, the number one religion on the island, which he described as, quote, a 99.9% country of Catholicity, very strict, end quote. Mike is also very cognizant of the complexities of identifying as Catholic and Indigenous. He is quick to acknowledge that Catholicism is the religion of the colonial conqueror of that region. Mike even admitted that when he learned about the role of the Catholic Church in the colonization and forced colonization of the indigenous peoples of North America, he was ashamed to be Catholic for a time. In seeking to reconcile the Catholic and indigenous facets of Mike's identity, Mike feels that he is called to educate others about Catholicism's deeply problematic relationship with indigenous peoples, while working to, quote, pay homage to people that it may have been forced into Catholicity, but have nonetheless accepted it, end quote. As a curandera, Mike's grandmother shared more than her Catholicism with her favorite grandson. She also passed on, quote, her craft, a trade she learned from her mother and grandmother. Mike says, my grandmother always identified to me that I was a healer. She also called me a storyteller in that language. She made sure I learned herbology, the natural medicine, talking to nature, respecting nature. We would have little secret meetings where she was homing into the idea of passing on the trade or the craft. She would take me out to create different poultices. She knew much about the healing properties, botanically and spiritually. This training as a curandero or folk healer would have a far-ranging impact not only on Mike's spiritual development, but on his vocational, professional development as well. He says the ability to heal ultimately led me to my profession as a physician, with the ability to be empathic and the ability to foresee events, something I don't readily talk about because it is not understood. But I have the ability to sense when someone is sick. It freaked people out at medical school when I would say, well, the problem is here. I would say 98% of the time I was correct. It's hard to explain. I would be able to read one's strong energy patterns. That was a pretty common practice for a Taino shaman. It wasn't called shaman, but that's pretty much the average description. This healing vocation also found expression in Mike's life in other ways. Mike is the Episcopal advisor of an independent Catholic priestly community. As an independent Catholic bishop, Mike ministers to marginalized and disenfranchised Catholics excluded from the spiritual and sacramental life of the Roman Catholic Church. Mike says, I think that was an advantage again for me to leave mainstream Catholicism. While it was the only organized religion I was ever taught, Roman Catholicism hasn't embraced LGBTQI plus inclusion and racial reconciliation to the degree that it needs to be embraced. It's my mission to make everyone feel the same and feel welcome, no matter who they are, where they are, or what their heritage is. Oh, I'm hoping that I see it yet in my lifetime. I think that's probably impossible. Progress moves at a snail's pace. Mike's spiritual identity then is rooted in Catholic tradition, nourished by Taino cosmologies and lifeways, and grows outward to feed and nurture and heal an increasingly diverse array of peoples. Mike shares that this multifaceted spiritual orientation would not have been possible had he not taken his grandmother's advice to become, quote, a whole person by accepting and integrating all of who he is with, quote, all the gifts the Creator has given him, end quote. Taken together, these three accounts of a Christian upbringing illustrate three distinct but interrelated experiences of Christianization in a modern indigenous post-colonial context. Dakota experienced the contemporary effects of Christianization as suppressive, alienating, and guilt-inducing, leading them to abandon their family's faith community in an attempt to throw off, quote, Christian tyranny. The Christian tyranny that was so detrimental to their growth and development in their formative years. Sandy's earliest experiences of her family's faith tradition were exceedingly positive, but a growing sense of connection to her tribal community and an increasing understanding of the history of colonization and Christianization in Native North America led her to abandon formally identifying with the Christian faith, even as she retained some connection to the Jesus way. Mike's Catholicism has informed and inspired his spiritual vocational journeys throughout his life. But his Catholicism is an intentionally enculturated one, amalgamating Taino lifeways and worldviews with an inclusive and affirming expression of Catholicism that reflect his identity and orientation as an indigenous queer Catholic. Whether it is through abandonment, adaptation, or integration, Native peoples have wrestled with the impacts and the effects of colonization and Christianization in their lived experiences that are crystallized in their recollections of their coming out and their coming to terms with their own two-spirit and indigiqueer identities. As I mentioned in the previous section, Sandy had a same-sex relationship in high school that she would later identify as her first love. While emotionally intimate, this relationship never passed beyond playful affection, however. It wasn't until college that Sandy began to experiment sexually and engage romantically with both men and women. Sandy had a string of relationships with men throughout her college years, relationships that she described as primarily physical, though she does recall having strong feelings toward one man she dated intermittently her sophomore year of college. She recounts with great humor, though, that this man later came out as gay. Sandy reports having been in love with two women she engaged with sexually during her college years. Both were white, and both had boyfriends during their romantic and sexual exchanges with Sandy. Sandy explained that this was considered the normal course of events at the time, an arrangement Sandy was exceedingly comfortable with, given that she did not then and does not now identify as a lesbian. It wasn't until Sandy became active in the American Indian movement that she began to learn about Two-Spirit and indigenous persons and communities. For this time, she became acquainted with the more sexually liberated ideologies prominent among AIM activists on the West Coast. Pockets within the AIM advocated for the abandonment of not only Christian marriage, but also the practice of monogamy with romantic and sexual relationships. It was in this context that Sandy first met persons who self-identified as gay, lesbian, or trans, given that Two-Spirit and indigenous were not terms commonly used until the 90s. Interestingly, there was also a contrary movement within the AIM that prioritized repopulating North America with phenotypical native peoples. As a result, this small but vocal sub-movement forbade same-sex interracial relationships on the grounds that these relationships would not produce discernibly Indian children. Sandy felt most comfortable in the repopulation movement within the AIM because it allowed her to engage in romantic and sexual relationships with women when she felt so inclined, but did not pressure her to come out or to self-identify as a lesbian. It was in this context that Sandy met and married her husband. They were married for 13 years and had 3 sons. Sandy describes this marriage as happy, but routine and loveless. She describes her husband as a devoted father, but a rather distant husband, speculating that he likely had multiple affairs during their 13 years of marriage. Sandy and her husband were divorced without rancor. They continued to be friends and to co-parent with little to no conflict. After her divorce, Sandy began to focus on her career in behavioral health. It was through work that Sandy met her current partner, a Caucasian woman from the East Coast who openly identifies as a lesbian. Sandy and her partner have lived together for 19 years, though they no longer share a bedroom. Sandy began to identify quietly as Two-Spirit and indigenous after attending Two-Spirit powwows in the early 2000s. Though she is not out of the closet to everyone, her closest family, friends, and business associates are aware that she has partnered with a lesbian woman. Even now, Sandy does not feel the need to classify her relationship or her sexuality, to share that with the world, feeling that those who know these things already know them. In contrast, Dakota self-identifies as out and proud and has recently come out as trans or Two-Spirit, quote, whatever vernacular you want to use, just as queer as they can be, end quote. Dakota states proudly that people can tell just by looking at me. They see this Indian woman and hear my deep, deep voice. There's no sense trying to hide that. In truth, Dakota is tired of trying to hide their sexuality and gender identity, having been forced to do so from an early age. Dakota says, "Oh, I knew when I was very young, and so did the family. Mommy and Daddy certainly knew. My brothers all sensed that I was different, probably even before I did, but none of us even knew what gay was. We didn't use that word, just said that I was different. I used to love to play with dolls and play house. I could roughhouse with the best of them, but I loved to make skirts out of things, and boy, did I love the little Indian boys that I ran around with. I was trying to get them to play house with me. They knew, we all knew. It was just the way it was." As with many young people, Dakota confirmed an innate same-sex attraction through fantasy and masturbation during puberty. Even then, Dakota felt a deep sense of shame, mixed with feelings of joy and, quote, aha, this is who I am. This important period of self-discovery was complicated By Dakota's growing sense that his father was in some way drawn to and sexually attracted to pubescent Dakota. While Dakota did not report that his father ever acted on these perceived feelings of sexual attraction to his son, it did have a lasting impact upon their relationship. He says, or they say, Daddy just couldn't accept his own issues with his sexuality. When you repress something, push it way down, it can become ugly. He didn't know what to do with those feelings. He just wasn't equipped. So he pushed me away. He avoided me. He wouldn't even really look at me, and that hurt me. I felt rejected. I took on his shame and his guilt, carried that around with me for years and years. The church gave it to him, and he gave it to me. It was generational, you see. We carry that around with us, and we give it to others, and round it goes. Dakota carried this shame and guilt around with him well into adulthood. It was through therapy and two-spirit ceremonies and gatherings that Dakota finally found healing, degradation, and restoration. Dakota says, I finally knew who I was, what I was. And whoosh, is really something. Dakota's father would not know this healing and reconciliation until after his passing into the spirit world. Dakota reports, my daddy still comes to see me. He's in the spirit world now, but he finally got his healing, his medicine. He speaks to me, comes to me in my dreams. He's even coming through now. He's here. I can hear you, Daddy. He's healed. We're healed. He gets it now. He really gets it. He's sorry. You know, the ancestors are working to bring this thing about. We just have to be ready. We have to be willing to step out there, not just two spirits, everyone. We all need healing. Daddy got his healing. He did. He loves me. He's telling me he loves me and that he's sorry. He finally understands what this is. Dakota first identified as a gay man in his early 20s, but has since come out as two-spirit and trans. They now present and dress as a woman and have adopted traditional women's ceremonial garb at two-spirit gatherings and during events with the LGBTQI+ community. Dakota is known as Mama or Mother to many, and they share that they, quote, finally feel at home in their own red skin. This journey to self-understanding and self-acceptance has been a long and arduous one with many twists and turns. Dakota reports, I shouldn't be here. I shouldn't be alive. I turned every way but up to find answers, to find what I was looking for, and most of it was not good. But Dakota did find their way. Even more, they now devote their time and energy to guiding others on a similar journey. Quote, we've got to share our medicine with young people. It's gone. It's been buried. We have to recreate it, come up with new ceremonies, new medicine. Two spirits were buried with their medicine. We can't go digging that up. It's just not there. We have to be our own medicine. We can't wait for the tribes to pull their heads out. They are some of the most homophobic, transphobic people you'll ever meet. They're infected with it. They've forgotten who they are. They've forgotten who we are. We have to do it ourselves across the tribes, a new rainbow nation. We have to. If we wait on them, it'll never happen. Mike's journey to accepting his sexual orientation began in conversations with his grandmother, who recognized at an early age that Mike was, quote, male dominant, but that he, quote, held both spirits within him. Mike understood intuitively that this could be, quote, a death sentence on the island where he was living, but he felt that it didn't matter much within his familial context. He recalls that the focus in his family was always on the contribution that you made as an individual to society. It didn't matter who you were, he said. Your role, what you contribute to society is, quote, the most important part. As a result, Mike felt comfortable sharing his evolving understanding of his sexual orientation with the maternal side of his family, a comfort and conversance that he would not share with his father. Mike reports that, in fact, it wasn't until shortly after Stonewall, probably in the US, where I came to terms with identifying as gay. But it wasn't until college that I was able to, so so that would have been 1976. Actually, I became involved in a relationship and began to identify in the vernacular so of being gay. That is probably the first time I remember because my grandmother said she didn't know the term gay, but she used the term that is called mire, which that is kind of someone who is a little bit perhaps more feminine, more outgoing, more the stereotype of gay. Then she said, "That's you." But it was nothing to be ashamed of, versus when I would come out to the States to visit my father. That conversation could not take place. I was not even myself able to really come out until 1980. Mike's indigenous identity was an asset in helping him to come to terms with his sexual identity, in part because of the privileged place Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons have in Taino culture and society. Mike reports, his grandmother said, "Be proud of who you are. You are a healer. You contribute much to society and you will be honored for your healing. And you will be honored for your spirit and the two spirits that live inside you." And that's the first time I ever heard that term. Or two or more, I believe she said, spirits that you hold. I think the Taino realized and did not condemn the concept of two-spirit, although it was not called that, because the Taino recognized that these people had a special place in the tribe. They were very much honored. The Creator placed you in society, a belief that has existed in the indigenous people for some time, something I believe non-indigenous, even most indigenous people, don't have a clear concept of these days. This sense that Two-Spirit and indigenous persons once held an honored sacred place in indigenous societies was shared among all of the interviewees, a perspective in concert with the historical analysis we explored yesterday. Even more, the conviction that this sacred role was lost as a direct result of colonization and Christianization is an underlying theme in most contemporary Two-Spirit and indigiqueer narratives. What is evidenced in the interviews we are exploring today is that a sense of connection with one's tribal community and a perceived continuity with the experiences and identities of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer ancestors is a liberative asset for indigenous persons struggling to come to terms with their own sexual orientation or gender identity within a contemporary context. Further, this sense of connection and continuity with the proud shared Two-Spirit and indigiqueer past informs and inspires not only the reclamation and restoration of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer identities in the present, it also, as we shall see, is the lens through which Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons and their allies lay claim to a healing vision for what the future can and should hold for Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons and communities. Coincidentally, the final theme to be explored is a result of the final question I posed to each of the interviewees. At the end of each interview, I asked the interviewees to reflect on what the future holds for Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons. It's interesting to note that there was a pregnant, labored pause before each elder ventured to respond, as if the topic had never been given much thought. This is perhaps due in part to the reality that for many Two-Spirit and indigiqueer persons, the focus of their lives has been on surviving the present in light of the past. This is a community that has likely felt at many times that the future was uncertain, or sadly, that they did not have a future for which to hope. Because all three interviewees struggled to respond to this inquiry as posed, I rephrased the question to be less abstract, more personal. I said, what if there were a young Two-Spirit or indigiqueer person reading this transcript or listening to this recording? They're just coming to terms with who the Creator has created them to be in this world. What would you say to them as they move into the 21st century and beyond? Rephrasing the inquiry in this way prompted a cautious response from one interviewee and generous responses from the other two, each teasing out their hopes and their concerns for the future of Two-Spirit and indigenous persons and communities. Sandy's response was the briefest and most sober. Her concern was that Two-Spirit and indigenous persons not be identified by their sexual orientation or gender identity. She maintains that an obsession with love and sex is an intrinsically Western mentality that is contrary to communal Native values. For Sandy, the best possible future for Two-Spirit and indigenous persons would be for them to be so accepted by their communities and integrated into their cultures that their status as Two-Spirit or indigenous persons would become unnoteworthy. Just one small facet of who they are as a person. She hopes for a time when intertribal Two-Spirit and indigenous queer powwows and ceremonial gatherings would be entirely unnecessary. When pressed about whether this perspective might be read and understood as a form of erasure, Sandy maintained that identity politics and the performative nature of many within the Two-Spirit and indigenous community has in some ways led to Two-Spirit and indigenous community or persons being shunned or shamed by tribal communities for being too queer. For Sandy, this is and will forever be the movement's biggest weakness. When asked what message she might have for future Two-Spirit and indigenous persons, Sandy spoke very briefly and generally about the need to be a good person, to respect one's elders, and the importance of learning one's language and culture so that it may be passed on to future generations. Mike's response was also focused on a concern that Two-Spirit and indigenous persons and communities not be limited by the categorical definitions of others that dominate in the West. Unlike Sandy, however, Mark's emphasis was on an expansive fluidity and pride that could be openly demonstrated and celebrated despite difficulties and in the face of certain opposition within and beyond the tribal community. Mike says, "Be yourself and explore. Do not let other people put you in a box or they will own you, own that part of you. I'm even somewhat concerned about the label of Two-Spirit because then you're saying you're only Two-Spirit. There may be that fluidity that I notice within other cultures, more than 2 or 3 genders, many ways of being, living the fluidity. I understand that indigenous people want something for themselves, a way to bring in their culture, and I'm all for that. Undoubtedly, it will cause some hostility. Say, let it go. You know what you are. You know from whence you came. Open yourself up for others to be able to see you for who you really are. Never allow yourself to be limited by others, and never allow yourself to be ridiculed. I think Two-Spirit people are the most misunderstood people probably in the world because no one has allowed them to live to their potential. Live to your potential and let the world be damned." When asked about his hopes for the Two-Spirit and indigenous community as they moved into the future, Mark reflected on the past, in particular on the harmonious convergence of Taino and North American tribal cosmologies and their shared respect for Two-Spirit peoples who they believe are sacred. I think the North American tribes and the Taino, Mike says, did not condemn the concept of Two-Spirit, whatever it is called, because it was sacred, what Catholics call a holy vocation, calling. If you look at our tribes, they're not that much different. The religious part of the Taino, they were buried in mounds. How odd is it that effigy mounds were also carried on in North America? For me, the idea of placing a body closer to the heavens, to the God or to the gods or the ancestors, that's how they saw us, special, closer to the gods, supported by, rooted in the earth. That's how we need to see ourselves, as seeds, as a bridge between earth and the heavens. Not as better, no, just special. Special role to play. That's the future, for us to take our people closer to the gods while here on earth. That's our call. That's who we're called to be, what we are called to do. It's for healing. We are the healers. Dakota's message, too, was one of warm acceptance and encouragement. Fighting back tears, Dakota spoke directly to people young and old who are wrestling with embracing a two-spirit or indigenous identity, especially those fearful of how they will be received by their families, kinship circles, and tribal communities. Dakota shared, "You can be whatever you want to be because I'll support you. I'll help you. I will help you on this journey. We will gather people to help you. Please do not listen to your head. Do not listen to that fear. Do not feed on that negativity. Your two-spirit community will help you to be the best, happiest person you were made to be, the way human beings were supposed to be, the way you were created to be. The old ones tell me, we can't allow Indian people to chip away at their little souls any longer, to take their hope. That's the message we have to get out. We have to find ways to get these people and tell them Mother Nature's got your back. The old ones have your back. You are not going on this journey alone." Dakota also dreams of a future in which two-spirit and indigenous people are celebrated ceremonially and culturally within their respective tribal communities, not just for two-spirit and indigenous persons, but for the health and vitality of the community as a whole. Dakota says this is what we need to do. We need to start honoring the two-spirit children. It has to start with the tribes, with anybody that will listen. You know what I'm saying? When two-spirit children become of age, we need to have a huge dance and a ceremony like they do for cis males and females, rite of passage. We need to bead their outfit, make a big feast and say thank you. Thank you for being two-spirit. Thank you for continuing our culture. That's what we're going to start doing. We have to. We have to pass it on. Otherwise, our people will continue to be sick. They're sick without this medicine. The old ones tell me they are bringing this medicine back. Whoosh. Did you feel that? That's healing, not just for Indian people, for all of us. The final sections of these interviews, taken in turn, show us something of the spectrum on which the hopes and dreams of our two-spirit and indigenous elders lay. Sandy hopes for a day when two-spirit and indigenous persons are so integrated into their community that the need to identify as two-spirit or indigenous becomes unnecessary, even obsolete. Mark longs for a time when two-spirit and indigenous persons can embrace a fluidity that challenges our categorical thinking while pushing indigenous communities to honor the sacred vocation inherent in two-spirit and indigenous identities and experiences. Dakota is working for a day when two-spirit and indigenous children are celebrated with sacred ceremonies and great feasts befitting their honored role within their families, kinship circles, and tribal communities. Differing as they are, these elders' hopes for the future evidence in their own way the shared conviction that two-spirit and indigenous lives and experiences are sacred. They cannot be understood using Western categorical concepts and worldviews. And the goal is reintegration of these identities and experiences into the ceremonial, social, and cultural life of their respective indigenous communities. So what now? What's the implication for the church? Well, first, it must be stated unequivocally that the church was demonically complicit in the evils of colonization, and that the forced Christianization of indigenous peoples was an act of cultural violence, the effects of which are still discernible and demonstrable today. Christian history is replete with examples of how the church, in its quest for political and temporal power, has continually aligned itself with corrupt governments across the centuries and around the globe in an attempt to spread the good news by the sword, slaughtering anyone who would stand in the way of Christian progress. It is a bloody, abhorrent history, one that I believe calls into question the legitimacy of the Christian community in all its forms and the efficacy and truth of the Christian message in all of its variations. The church has yet to provide a full accounting of its sins, let alone done its penance. From a Catholic perspective, it can therefore not expect absolution from the indigenous persons and communities to whom it must confess for the vilest of sins and offenses. The most mortal of these sins is the sin of silence, not a sin of commission, but one of omission. The greatest sin is not what the church did, but what the church has continually failed to do. The church did not see the image of God in our indigenous brothers, sisters, and kin. The church did not honor the unique covenant Native peoples have with the Creator, a covenant that existed from time immemorial, long before a European missionary ever set foot on North American soil. The church did not stop colonizers from raping, murdering, and pillaging their way across an entire continent, but rather baptized these various forms of violence and oppression as the divine right of kings, manifest destiny, and yes, that holy doctrine of discovery. The church is silent even now as we discover thousands upon thousands of unmarked graves, the unhallowed resting places of indigenous children who did not survive their boarding school's attempt to save the man by killing the Indian within them. The church is silent even now as 84% of Native women will experience violence in their lifetimes, as 56% of Native women will experience sexual violence, with murder being the third leading cause of death for Native women between the age of 10 and 34 in this country, in our time. The church is silent even now as Two-Spirit and Indigenous persons suffer the lowest rate of full-time employment in the nation, with 23% of Two-Spirit and Indigenous people living in, quote, extreme poverty, and an astounding 55% classifying as food insecure every single year. The church is silent even now as Two-Spirit and Indigenous youth experience high levels of rejection from their Christianized families and kinship circles, making them 3 times more likely to use controlled substances, 8 times more likely to attempt suicide, and 16 times more likely to experience high levels of depression. The church is silent even now as up to 40% of Two-Spirit youth experience homelessness during their lifetime, with 26% of those youth being forced, quote, from their home upon revealing their Two-Spirit or Indigenous identity to their Indian parents. The church is silent even now as Indigenous families, kinship circles, and tribal communities who have internalized that oppression reject their Two-Spirit and Indigenous brothers, sisters, and children with lateral violence, repression, and marginalization. The church has been strangely silent in all of these things. Silence is complicity. Complicity is sin. I hope that our time together over this week has worked in some small way to end that silence. I pray that you will join me in centering Two-Spirit and Indigenous voices, celebrating Two-Spirit and Indigenous histories, and protecting Two-Spirit and Indigenous lives. But talking about things isn't enough. I know that's what we academics and pastors love to do. We can talk all day. But when you get home, you've got to do something. Do anything to engage with and, more importantly, empower Native persons and communities. Native peoples are contemporary peoples with contemporary problems. So speak up, act out. For the love of God, get in trouble. It's a lot of fun. Trust that the Creator is working with, in, and through you to bring healing, justice, and reconciliation to all our relations. Thank you.